got a bit of footage that I want to track in After Effects. I've imported it into the new project here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new composition out of this and apply a 3D tracker. So in After Effects, I've imported my footage. I'm just going to drag and drop it onto the new composition button, and that's going to make a new composition the same resolution, frame rate and length as my bit of footage. So this is a bit of footage of the newish G block building over behind the main ALX block, and as you can see from this footage, it's pretty shaky. I've done it handheld, and I've just sort of walked sideways along this path filming the building. So tracking in After Effects is pretty simple, provided it works properly. All we need to do is select our footage in the composition, go to our effects menu, and under the perspective effects, the top one is 3D camera tracker. So I'm going to hit that, and what we should get is a coloured band that appears across our picture, and it says it's analysing the footage, and all we have to do now is wait. So that was under the effects menu, under perspective, 3D camera tracker. Now, depending on how long your footage is, this might take a few seconds, it might take a few minutes. This bit of footage I think is about 20 seconds long, so hopefully this won't take too long. What will happen once you've created the effect is in your effects controls panel, usually over on the left, there'll be a few features in this effect. One thing that's really important is the shot type. And at the moment, and by default, it's set to fixed angle of view. Just one tip for when you're shooting video that you know you're going to 3D camera track, it's a really good idea not to zoom on your lens, on your camera while you're shooting. You want to keep the same focal length for the lens. If you change it partway through, it makes it really hard for the software to calculate where things are in perspective, because your perspective changes when you zoom. So in general, if you're shooting footage for tracking, don't use the zoom at all. If you want to get closer to something, walk closer to it, don't use the zoom button. Now this is still analysing. We don't get a little wee countdown anywhere, unfortunately, so we have to just kind of sit and wait. This shouldn't take too long. So at the analysing stage, what After Effects is doing is it's looking for those features in the video footage. It's looking for bright coloured dots or corner points or areas of colour that are a particular shape, and what it's doing is it's finding those, and then frame by frame it's looking at where those bits of detail have all gone. Once it's identified all those features and tracked them and followed them, the next step that it does is what's called solving. The coloured band here will change colour. Oh, there we go. It's solving the camera, so now that it's figured out where all those bits in the video were and where they're moving around, it's now trying to from there figure out where the camera was that shot that footage. Okay, now once it's finished doing that, you might not see anything, but if you run your cursor over the picture carefully, you might see a whole bunch of little triangles and sort of a red bullseye kind of shape. You may also see a bunch of little coloured crosses, and if you can't really see those, go over to your camera tracking effects on the left hand side, and the tracking point size, drag that up until you can start to see these points in your footage. You should have larger ones on foreground objects, and you should have small ones on background objects, and if you scrub through your footage, you should see that they kind of follow along generally, and they stick to objects, and some of them appear and disappear. Those are your tracking points, or your tracking features that After Effects has identified and has followed along the duration of that footage. Okay, so one thing you can check, so that's it, that's the camera tracking done. We don't do anything, it's pretty much automatic, and there's not much more that we can do to it. What we can do, if we go to these effects, there's an advanced tab on the left hand side in the effects panel. If you open that up, there should be an average error value. Mine looks a little bit unusual, but that average error hopefully should be less than a pixel. It might be point something of a pixel. If it's above a pixel, it means that the accuracy of this track may not be really good. The only thing that you can do if you're not getting a good track is turn on the detailed analysis button, which means that After Effects will go through and analyze all the footage again, but it'll basically try harder, and it'll try and solve what you've got. But let's see what we've got and see if this is kind of working. So what the camera has done is it tried to identify all those visual points in the 3D space that we've filmed, and it stuck little markers on each of those points. What we want to do now is we need to sort of identify ourselves. Where is everything in this 3D space? How can we relate to this 3D space? So what we're going to do is we're going to try and find a flat area on the ground, and we're going to define that as the ground of our 3D space. And we're also going to define the origin or the center of our 3D space. What I'm going to do is I'm going to scrub through my timeline, and towards the end there's a concrete path that leads to the building. I want to be able to look pretty much straight down that path, because I'm going to use this as my ground, it's my ground plane, and I'm going to use this as my starting point. Now, if you scrub through the timeline towards the end where you can see this path, if you run your cursor just up and down that path, you should see a bunch of triangles appear with that red target in the middle, and hopefully that red bullseye target should kind of look like it's sitting flat on the ground there. It should look like its perspective kind of matches up with that pathway. If it doesn't, if it's on a wacky angle, or if it's in a crazy direction, that's an indicator that maybe your tracking hasn't worked that well. But mine looks pretty good, and I think that perspective looks about right. I think we've probably got, well, from my point of view, I've probably got a good track. So what I want to do now is I'm going to tell After Effects these tracking points here are identifying the ground, and I want to set that as my ground plane. So what I want to do is I want to take at least 3 of those little tracking coloured crosshair points. I'm going to select them just by holding down Shift and clicking on each one of those 3 points, and I want the 3 points that are giving me a bullseye that looks like the perspective is correct. So I'm going to select one, hold down Shift, I'm going to select those 3 in the middle, and to me that bullseye target kind of looks like the perspective matches my scene. Now I'll just show you an example of what wouldn't be right. If I selected one here, maybe one up on the wall there, and one here, and now I've got a bullseye that's kind of floating in the space somewhere crazy, and obviously that doesn't match the perspective of my ground at all. So what I want is at least 3 points on the ground that are identifying this flat plane. You can use more than 3 if you think you've got more than that are creating this flat plane. Once you've selected them, what you need to do is right click the area where you've selected, and from the menu you want to set that as the ground plane and the origin. So if you remember from Cinema 4D, the origin is the center of our 3D world. So what we're telling After Effects is this spot here, that's the ground, it's flat, and that's going to be the center of our 3D world that we're recreating. So just click that. Nothing will happen visually, but that's going to be a useful thing to do. Okay, so now we've told After Effects where our ground plane is and where our origin is. We want to right click that area again, and we want to create a solid and a camera. So what you should see on your timeline is we've now got a camera added to our composition, and we've got a solid. And the solid, this is the thing that's going to be visually helpful for us. It should be sitting flat on the ground, matching the perspective of the ground in our shot. And if we very carefully click and drag on one of the points on the corner of it to make it bigger, I can see it a little bit more clearly now. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this solid around so that it's kind of matching my pathway. So hopefully it's going to kind of aim up and down my pathway. The way I'm going to do this is to select the solid in my composition. I'm going to hit R for rotation. And I want to, this is the really important bit, we want to rotate it only on its z-axis. Its z-axis is the axis pointing away from the flat plane of the solid. It's the blue axis when we look at it in After Effects, and it's the z-axis that we can see in our rotation value here. So if I click and drag on this Z rotation button, I should see that solid just spinning around on the ground there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and line this up with the path that I'm looking down. So I'm just going to do this by eye. I'm going to kind of line it up. I might just use my my axis here just to move it to the side a little bit so it's in the middle of the path. Be very careful when you do this. Don't move it up and down away from the ground plane. That's not good news. Only move it from side to side so that you can get it in the middle of that pathway. Once it's in the middle of the path, I'm going to use these central points on the solid, not the corner points, the ones in the halfway up and down the edges. Those are the ones that just let us change the width and the length of the solid. And I'm going to pull on those a little bit, and I should get something that kind of looks like it's matching up with the perspective of my path. It may not be exact. Mine's not quite right, I don't think, but I think it's close enough. Oops, I've just moved mine. Better undo that. Yeah, my perspective isn't quite matching up, so I think I might not have a great track. But anyway, I've got the solid. It's basically sitting, covering part of my path. Okay, so now I can check, do I actually have a reasonable looking track here? If I scrub through my timeline here, the other way that we can do this to preview this is just to take your cursor back to the start of the timeline, press the space bar, and After Effects will preview that composition. It'll draw it out and it'll do a sort of a temporary render. And once it's finished doing its temporary render, which you can see by this little green bar that's progressing across my composition, we should see it'll play back a little more smoothly, and we should get a good idea of whether or not my plane is sitting in my footage and it looks like it's kind of tracked. Okay, so in my case, it kind of looks like it's working. That plane definitely looks like it's sticking to the footage. It looks like the perspective is pretty much lined up with my footage. So to me, that looks like it's not a bad track. It's probably not great, but it's not bad. And it's probably good enough for what we need. Okay, I'm going to make another solid as well to give me a better idea of how my track is looking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a solid that represents one of these walls on the building itself. So I need to get back to my footage and back to that camera tracker with the little markers so I can create another solid. So select your footage, make sure that you click on the 3D camera tracker effect, otherwise you won't see the little tracking dots. And now what I'm going to do near the start of my footage is I'm going to try and find a bunch of dots, tracking points on this wall, this big wall at the back, that if I select them, make a sort of a bullseye perspective that kind of matches this back wall. Now, looking at this, mine aren't looking too good. Oh, there's one there that looks not too bad. I'm going to scrub through a little bit further. So what I'm looking for is when I run my cursor over there, like here's a pretty good example. I've got a bullseye shape that is pretty much looking like it's stuck on the wall there. Some of these other ones, the bullseye is on an angle all over the place, but this one here looks pretty good. So I might click on that, and then what I'm going to do is so I've selected that area, I'm going to right click, and I'm just going to create a solid there. I don't need to create a camera now, I don't need to set the ground plane and origin, I've already done that. All I want is another solid. So there's my wall solid, and I can select it in my composition, and what I'm going to do is, again, I'm just going to try and move it, slide it up that wall, and just change the size of it a little bit so it matches this wall. And what I'm looking to do is to see if this matches up with my footage, which will tell me whether or not I've got a good track. So I've placed my solid on the end of this this building, and I'm just going to go back to the start, hit space again, and just let that preview and just sort of see what it looks like. Okay, so mine seems to be working okay. I can see if I look carefully that the perspective on my planes, my solids that I've made, it's not perfect. I can see that the angle doesn't look exactly the same as the building, but it's pretty good. And quite often that's good enough for us. So I'm pretty happy with my track so far. Okay, so that's the basics of 3D camera tracking in After Effects. We've put the footage in, we've applied the tracking effect, and once it's done its solving, we've identified certain areas in that footage where we can create some markers, some solids, which help to check whether the track is good and will help us when it comes to working in 3D. We've created a couple of things that are identifying the ground plane and a wall in 3D space, so these are going to be useful in the future.